Alright guys, well, for the foreseeable future, this might very well be how we do class. I'm going to do my best to kind of continue as we would have. Obviously, asking questions in class and things like that are probably not going to happen. Certainly if you have any questions that you just got to know the answer to, you can throw me an email. You should all have my email address. It's where you'll be submitting your assignments anyways. First things first, I want to make sure that you are familiar with my website. In order to have gotten to this video, you should already be familiar with the website. But you should already have seen this page to be able to get to the video and all that kind of stuff. The weekly instructions are what you should have gone to immediately, and then that would have given you the ability to go to any one of these other spots. So under our notes section, we have this brand new button here, the video section. And right now, only one video is actually uploaded of my stuff. Depending on how long this thing goes, we'll have probably that many videos. I'm expecting maybe a section a week, maybe a little bit less, just because some of it is particularly long. Specifically, World War II might take us a couple of weeks, because there's a lot going on there. Before you get going any further, I am going to have you pause the video here in just a minute, and I'd like you to go to the American Revolution Part 1, watch this video from Oversimplified. That, you know, it's got a comical take, and it's fun to watch and everything as far as his storytelling ability and everything, and I enjoy the animations, but also keep in mind that it's solid history. And what I want you to do when you're watching it is I want you to kind of review American history a little bit. You all should be at least somewhat familiar with American history as a result of earlier classes. However, in my experience, that is not always the case. Hence why I'm adding this little video in here. So I'd like you to watch part 1, and then when you get done with that, go over and watch part 2. These will open into new tabs for you, so you won't lose your place here on this video. When you get done with part 2, then you'll just come back and you can continue the video from here. The time to pause would be now, and go watch those videos. Okay. You should have already watched the American Revolution videos. Hopefully you enjoyed them. They are really quite solid history. So, moving on. The French Revolution. When we get done with this section, I am going to have you go watch the oversimplified French Revolution videos. It's not a necessity to necessarily wait until then, but there's going to be stuff in those videos that if you're not already at least somewhat familiar with the subject, might be a little difficult to keep up. So I want to do these notes first, and when we're done doing the notes, then you can jump over, watch the video. Hopefully by the end of it you'll really get this stuff down. The videos are entertaining enough. I hope you give them a chance, even though no, I am not giving a grade on the watching the videos or anything. I don't really see any point to giving a grade on watching the video like that. So the French Revolution. Lots of causes, lots of reasons for these people to be upset with various things. One of the big ones is the American Revolution. You know, the video series focuses on the American side of it, and doesn't really give a huge amount of the French side, but the French side is incredibly important. The United States very likely would not have won the war against Britain without France's involvement. it's also quite expensive for the French to have gotten involved there. In addition to that, we have this general shift in how people are thinking about government, about state power, about money and their positions in the class social structure, stuff like that. So there's this overall thought towards rights of specifically the poor. Also a general idea towards reform through various means, and an idea that the government really shouldn't be running every single part of our lives, and that's problematic in an area that has a king as powerful as France's king is. This king is a Bourbon. You may recall that name from before spring break, where we talked about multiple wars that were fought specifically between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. By the time of the French Revolution, those kinds of tensions have mostly gone away. Not because these families suddenly don't care about each other, or that they no longer have one or the other involved. It's actually because the youngest daughter of Maria Theresa, the last truly powerful Habsburg, and the grandson of the King of France, they ended up getting married. Now, this was absolutely a political union. This had nothing to do with love or anything like that. These people had never even met each other, and days after meeting each other ended up married, in the hopes that whatever heir would end up coming out of that union, you would end up with not only the most powerful king of all of Europe, but also an end to the hostilities between these two very powerful families. As I said, the American Revolution was a major part of the rising tensions, specifically because it was expensive, and because it was so expensive, the French had to find money somehow, and so they ended up raising taxes. This is after they had already raised taxes after the 7 Years' War. These taxes also hit only one group. So there was this system that was in place. It was the estate system. The estates described what political power you would have. The first estate was made up of the clergy. The second estate was made up of the nobility. And the third estate was made up of commoners. The clergy, priests, bishops, whoever else, the nobility, that aristocracy, landowning elite group, they were exempt from most taxes. The peasantry, the commoners, ended up basically covering all the taxes for the country. So the people who have the least are the ones who are required to pay the most. It's not great. Well, for them. It's awesome for clergy and nobility. So as a result of this kind of political issue of not having enough power for the commoners, having far too much power for the clergy and nobility, they also look to the king as having far too much power. He is insanely powerful. This is now the grandson. So we had Louis the 14th long time ago, who kind of expanded the power. He was the most powerful of all of the French kings. His son, Louis the 15th, took over. Louis the 15th, also absolutely incredibly powerful. He is the guy who gets involved in the 7 Years' War. And then, as he gets older, his son actually passes away, and so it is his grandson who is next in line for the throne. His grandson, the one married to Marie Antoinette, Marie Antoinette, who is the youngest daughter of Maria Theresa. So lots of names I know, but Marie Antoinette you may recognize. She's kind of a popular name. We'll get into them a little bit more later. So they are outrageously powerful. The king and queen live lavish lives that they just don't really have any limits. They don't know anything about what it's like to live as one of the peasantry. And so the peasants in particular are going to be very upset about this. At the upper end of the commoner group, you find the middle class, a relatively new group that has started to rise. This is an educated group. They are bankers, lawyers, teachers, doctors, people who have education, who have been successful, able to earn a little bit of money, and who have no title and therefore have none of the privilege that the nobility has, even though, as far as wealth goes, they may very well be the same as the nobility. But without that title, they don't have any of the political power of the nobility. And then you've got your peasantry who pay far too much in taxes to the point that they can't even afford food. And when you've got starving people who already see injustice to the system and how it's set up, you're kind of establishing yourself as a powder keg ready to explode. While all this is going on, you've got a pretty big name. It's one of my all-time favorite guys, actually, Thomas Paine, who is going to end up writing Common Sense for the Americans. This is going to be one of the main pieces of literature that is going to help push the Americans into fighting. Then a few years later, he'll end up writing a lot more stuff, but the two really big ones that he writes are Rights of Man and Age of Reason. Rights of Man is dealing with how basically the French ought to get rid of their monarchy, and Age of Reason dealing with his beliefs on religion and how we shouldn't be Christian or Muslim or Jewish or that sort of stuff. He's going to argue against that. In fact, he's going to be one of the driving voices behind the creation of deism, which we mentioned in the Enlightenment chapter. Okay, so one of the other issues that France is facing is this lack of national unity. This is going to be especially problematic. There's a lot of different groups that don't see themselves as particularly French. They don't have any kind of connection to France or to the king or to their fellow countrymen who happen to be living in the same area, but don't speak the same language, don't have the same cultural backgrounds. In some cases, may not be the same religion or any number of other differences, and that is going to be an issue that will be addressed eventually quite violently. And that brings us to the first phase. I'm actually going to pause here for a moment, and I'll come back with the questions. We'll answer the number of questions that we've been able to go through. All right. You should already have the questions pulled up on maybe a separate tab, something that you can refer to. I'll have them here, and we'll kind of switch back and forth between the questions and the notes, trying to keep track of everything. I'll say this, if you reach out to anybody else that might be in your class, and let them know kind of that I'm answering these questions. Maybe they didn't feel like watching the video or something like that. The French Revolution area is challenging. There's a lot going on. It is a difficult section to explain, much less understand if you're not really listening to explanation. So if you are in contact with any of your classmates, you might throw them a line and just say, hey, it's worth watching these videos. I am trying to keep them a little bit quicker than normal. We'll be speeding up soon, I promise. All right, so what were the 3 causes of the revolution? Well, you can refer back to this first part that we just covered. So France severely in debt after the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. And so they were raising taxes, even considering taxing the nobility. That's 1. 2 would be just the setup of the system of legal privileges based on the 3 estates. The fact that the king has absolute power and limited political representation for a number of people. And then the third thing would be the nobility's fear of losing their privilege, the middle class not having political power, and the peasantry starving to death because taxes were so high. It's a lot more than 3 things, but that's how we're going to sum it up. A little bit shorter, hopefully. All right, that brings us to the revolt of the nobility and the Estates General. So the nobility is not happy with the king, who has passed fiscal and tax reforms in the hopes that he can kind of stave off the problems of the state with how they've been spending their money. Of course, it didn't really impact him, and that's going to be one of the problems later on. The king and queen, Marie Antoinette and King Louis XVI, are honestly, it's hard to put into words how out of touch they were and how much money they spent. We're talking over $100 million per month. Now, granted, this isn't $100 million as today would be, and off the top of my head, I don't know what the transfer rate is. It doesn't matter. That's a lot. When you've got people starving in the streets, and then you've got the king and queen spending well over $100 million per month, that's just insanity. So, something to keep in mind. Everybody generally knows that they spend a lot. That $100 million, by the way, is a lowball number, but they actually will seize his checkbook and check where he's been spending his money and how much money he's been spending, and then they're going to publish it in the newspaper for everybody to see. So no huge surprise why Louis XVI and his wife ended up beheaded. But I'm getting ahead of myself just a little bit. So the Estates General is kind of similar to Parliament in a way. Not really like Congress, because it's not so much elected the way that we think of elections. People are selected to represent others in the Estates General. But the big difference between the Estates General and Parliament, in Parliament, they had elections for some, not for everyone, but some had elections. For Parliament, they had powers written down. They had the Magna Carta, various other pieces of legislation that gave them the power, and it was written down. And that is so important when we're talking about laws. That it is not just a verbal agreement, hey, I'll do this thing if you do this thing. It was actively written down, here's the powers. So because of that, the Parliament is able to kind of get away with certain things and hold the king to certain things that the Estates General simply couldn't do. Now, granted, the Parliament ended up fighting a civil war, and that's how they really limited the king, at least at first. But with the Estates General, they don't have any written power. Their power was established by verbal agreement with a king long before even the Bourbon family took over. This is during the Valois dynasty. And this king doesn't really see it, and I don't want to blame it all on the king. It's this king's family, his grandpa, his great-grandpa, his, however many greats you want to go with, through the entire group. They didn't really see the Estates General as being particularly useful. So Louis is going to think, okay, well, maybe I can use the Estates General, go around the nobility, because the nobility is only one of the three estates, and while they're powerful, they're not everything. So he thinks, okay, let's get the Estates General together. They'll approve my reforms because, it makes sense. We lower spending, we raise taxes, everybody's better off. Not so much. Estates 1 and 2, the clergy and nobility, seek to protect their privileges. The third estate is so fed up with everything, is so tired of seeing people starve in the streets while they know others could help and don't. They're so tired of the monarchy having unlimited power, absolutely no checks on the king. They decide that they want to force a fundamental political change. They want a constitutional monarchy. Basically, they want the same thing that Britain has at this time. And the third estate represents just over 90% of the total population. You would think they would have more influence than they had, but actually they were the smallest influence within the estates. And this imbalance in the estate system is going to be problematic. Eventually, there was actually a moment where the estate goes to meet up, the third estate goes to meet up. They've decided, now we're not dealing with the first or second estate, let's meet together, let's come up with plans of how we were going to force the king, the monarchy, the nobility into compliance with this new constitutional monarchy that we want to come up with. And when they show up to the building where the estates would meet, they were quite literally locked out. There were chains on the door, there were guards standing over it, and they were told that the king has disbanded the Estates General and that they are not allowed to meet there. So they decided to meet up on a nearby tennis court that the nobility used for a good time. And there on the tennis court, they take the tennis court oath. This is in June 1789. Y'all know I am not big on dates or anything like that. Nothing's really changed with the whole date thing, except so much is going to go on and it's going to happen so quickly that I'm going to be throwing dates at you just to try and keep a timeline intact. So bear with me there. So the third estate gets together. They come to a decision that they will become the National Assembly now. They are no longer the third estate. They are the National Assembly, representing the vast majority of the kingdom, and they are going to continue meeting until they draft a constitution, which is going to take a little while. And they follow through, so, props. Just 1 month later, there's going to be rumors that Louis XVI is bringing in troops, even possibly foreign troops, to crush the National Assembly. Those foreign troops more than likely would have been Austrian, because that was Marie Antoinette's background, and of course she'd be working with the king to, keep the people down. And there will be very outspoken leaders coming from the middle class. They will get crowds made up of lower class groups who are starving, who are angry, who are ready to hurt people. And these middle class leaders will kind of send out the lower class to storm the streets and take control of Paris. And this is known as the Paris Uprising that starts in July 1789. Those rebel leaders end up declaring that the city is now under their control, specifically the control of the middle class, that they recognize the authority of the National Assembly to make changes to the government, and they are in charge. And using this example, similar rebellions are going to start breaking out across France. All right, we're going to switch back to our questions here for a moment. So what was the problem with the Estates General system? Well, the fact that Estates 1 and 2 made up less than 10% of the population, but either of them had more power than the third estate, would be a major problem. You know, when you've got any one group that makes up the majority and has no real say, that's going to be problematic. They are also not going to agree on what needs to be done. The two powerful ones that have all the privileges, for some reason, seem to want to protect those privileges. And the third estate is willing to totally revamp the government into a constitutional monarchy. So this ultimate disagreement is going to be problematic. Number 3, what was the tennis court oath? That is when the third estate ended up meeting and deciding that they were now the National Assembly and that they were going to draft a constitution. All right, and how did the revolution begin? Specifically, Paris, 1789. This would be the Paris Uprising of 1789. How to get started? That was those rumors that were getting started, that he was going to bring in troops and therefore leaders from the middle class, send lower class crowds to take control of Paris. Alrighty. The context of the uprising. We had some problems. 2 years of bad harvests, therefore higher prices on food. About a third of the workers in Paris specifically were unemployed when the food prices were at their highest. The lower class was kind of looking at the king as being separated from the problems, that he didn't really know what it was like, and they're not wrong. He was out in Versailles, the grand palace that I know I've shown pictures of over time. This grand palace is about 20 miles outside of Paris, which means he doesn't know what it's like in Paris. So they're not wrong about that. They'll also look to the National Assembly as being the primary voice of the people. And they utterly believe the king is trying to destroy their freedoms, their liberties. In this, they're likely incorrect. That was a fear. That was not necessarily fact. Certainly, we've never seen any evidence of that anywhere else. Kind of how the whole thing gets started, the Great Fear. So, this term, the Great Fear, is going to, unfortunately, likely confuse you later on down the road. We will be discussing the Great Terror, and those things can get kind of confusing. So try and remember the Great Fear is very early on in the Revolution. This is a period of time where there was this big rumor that the nobility is hoarding and burning food specifically to starve out the poor who are revolting, because if you can starve them to death, you don't have to fight them. There was also the rumor that those Austrian troops that I mentioned before were invited by the king to help defend him. Not only is that offensive, but that is treasonous. And so the result was the peasants attacking manor houses. These are these grand houses that are owned by the nobility, the land run by the nobility, where they had serfs working the land. This is going to officially end feudalism. While it was not particularly popular anymore at this point, it had still been around. Now it's done. And they'll also attack church property and try and drive out both the First and Second Estate. And various other members of what formerly was known as the Third Estate, now the National Assembly, will also attack and take over land. Probably the most important document to come out of the French Revolution would be the Declaration of Rights of Man. This is somewhat similar to our Declaration of Independence. It's almost a cross between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. This is an outline of what they plan to do with the Constitution. So the Declaration says we are ending the estate system. It's gone. Everyone is born with equal rights. Every man born with equal rights. Sorry, ladies. That we are getting rid of the idea of nobility. We are getting rid of the idea of commoners and things like that. The purpose of government is to protect the rights of all men. And the source of sovereign power, pretty much the king's power, comes from everyone within the nation, not just the nobility, as it has been for almost 1,000 years at this point. And they also want to limit state power, specifically in its ability to deprive men of liberty, which is basically locking them up, unless they're proved to need locking up. If they're a political prisoner, that's not okay. But if they break a law and they are found guilty, then yeah, sure, lock them up. So they're actually trying to find maybe a middle ground, and you may recognize some of that as being pretty similar to the Declaration. In large part, that's because Thomas Jefferson was involved in this process. He did not write it, but he did help with it. So, pretty big name dealing with Declaration. Property rights, and this is going to be a significant difference between the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Declaration of Independence. Property rights is going to be listed as a fundamental right of all men. And that is a pretty significant one that is not present in the United States. All right, I think that's a good spot. We're going to switch over and take a look at questions here. So, how are people living at the beginning of the revolution? Looking at the contextual area, which would be the context of uprising. There we go. So, we've got 2 years of bad harvests, so high food prices. About a third of people in Paris are unemployed. The lower classes saw the king as separate from problems. National Assembly was the voice of the people, and they believed the king was trying to destroy their liberty. So that would be our context there. And then describe the Great Fear. Well, that's that period where they believed the nobility was hoarding and burning food to starve them out, that the king had invited Austrian troops to help protect him. And this is a period when the peasants will attack the manor houses and church property in order to drive out the first two estates. The main elements of the Declaration of Rights of Man, you're really just looking at these highlighted sections. The Declaration ends the estate system and establishes all men born with equal rights, and that state power has to be limited, and that men cannot lose their liberty except under certain conditions. Okay, I'm going to take a break, go grab some water and stuff like that. I will be back. You might want to also take a break for a minute. If not, this video will pick right back up in just a second. So so that leads us to the moderate political settlement, 1789 to 91. So for a couple of years, things are going to chill out. Not much of a revolution. You had this great fear, this uprising from your peasantry, some legal changes, and then things kind of chill. The moderates, the groups who have been writing up this constitution, end up coming up with a plan where they're going to keep the king in place. He's going to act as the executive power, pretty much similar to the president, at least in many ways. It's still going to be something hereditary where his son will eventually take over. And the legislative power, the powers to write laws, are going to go to the assembly. So this is a pretty reasonable approach. The National Assembly is going to end up creating a body of laws to reform the social and political order. They're going to get rid of the idea of guilds. They're going to sell off lands that belonged to the church and to the king. They're going to push the clergy to swear an oath that recognizes the assembly's power and that the assembly is not bound by religious law. That one they're not going to be thrilled with, but it's okay. Considering what's about to happen when they get upset with it, it's fine. So, who was affected? Well, they are going to restrict the vote to property owners, much like the United States has. At this time, there was this belief that if you owned property, then you were more likely to care what happened to your property. Therefore, you were more likely to care what happened to your country, and that made you more active in political life. Whereas if you just happen to live there, you don't own any property, that means that you're a passive citizen. They will eventually rethink that, as will the Americans, but it's a reasonable idea, even if in execution not great. The lower classes are going to see the revolution as kind of their revolution, and so they're going to be a little upset about that because they expected it's going to give them equal political rights, and it's not. So that's problematic. The best politically organized groups, the artisans and shopkeepers, start to see a connection between political rights and social rights, where if you want to have power in society, you must have power politically, and vice versa. If you have power in society, you will have power politically. This is going to lead us to the second phase, and the second phase is going to get a little rough. Actually, you know what? This is a good time to look at our questions. So, I believe we are on number 7 there. What are the main elements? Oh, nope, we did that one. Never mind. Ignore me. So, number 8. Describe the moderate political settlement reached in the first phase of the revolution. Well, that's what we just did. So, the moderate political settlement was the idea that we have a constitutional monarchy where we keep the king in place as the executive power, and the legislative power goes to the assembly. That's all I'm really looking for there. Alright, so the second phase, the radical phase, also known as the Jacobin phase. I've heard it pronounced various ways. I pronounce it Jacobin. I know people are going to pronounce it differently. I believe the video that I'm going to have you watch at the end of this also pronounces it differently. It doesn't matter. Jacobin, that's what I'm going with. So the Jacobin political party rises up in 1791 to 1792. There is a general opposition to the revolution within France. The clergy, there's going to be some that take the oath that say, yes, we're going to follow what the state says, and we understand that the state is not going to be held to the religious laws or anything. And then there's going to be other clergy that say no, they don't want to take that particular oath, and therefore they are forced to take the oath. So, not thrilled with that. There's also a general opposition to loss of privilege from the nobility and from the clergy, and the king's desire to restore powers, his efforts to rally troops against the revolution, going to basically lead to some suspicions. There's also going to be kind of local opposition to policies made in Paris. Basically, other cities around France that don't like what's coming out of Paris, and so they're against whatever Paris is doing, but they're cool with their neighbors. So this would be something along the lines of Washington, D.C. sends out something that says, hey, you got to do this thing, and the state of Texas says, not really thrilled with that. It happens. They are especially going to have problems with taxing and how Paris is treating the church. So all of that is going on within France. Then outside of France, you also are going to see some other monarchies who see this revolution and go, oh no, that's not good. What if they turn on us? What if our people are inspired by this revolution and they decide to rise up against us? And the two most important out of these, Austria and Prussia, Austria sees this not only as a threat to their power, but remember, the leader of Austria is Maria Theresa, and her daughter is married to the King of France and is now under house arrest. Well, sort of. They're being held in a palace in Paris. It's not that bad. But, technically, they're not allowed to leave and all that. Prussia, as you may recall, I mentioned, is the largest, most significant state in Germany, and is basically going to be Germany until we get the actual Germany, which is going to be in the late 1800s. There's also going to be a general radicalization where the lower class politics are going to get meaner and meaner starting at the beginning of 1792, because they are going to be very angry about the fact that they don't have full citizens' rights. They can't vote because they don't have property, and yet they were the ones who did the work. Reasonable issues. They also are still seeing those incredibly high prices for food, especially grain, making it rather difficult to, have bread and stuff like that. And they were pushing for laissez-faire economic policies. The idea that the government should keep its hands off and allow the market to kind of just do what it does. This is pure capitalism, if you want to think of it that way. And the banning of guilds is absolutely not laissez-faire economic policy. That is very much the government taking an absolute hold. So they're not thrilled with that. In addition, there's a general fear of counter-revolutionaries, basically middle-class people who wanted to take over the revolution to make it their own thing and not something that supported the poor. And so the poor, this general fear is going to lead them to rise up against the middle class who led them before. They also are going to believe quite deeply in spreading the revolution to everyone. Everybody should be just as happy as we are while we sit and starve. They thought the king, the nobility, and the church, this former first and second estates, and of course the monarchy itself, was seeking to crush the rebellion. In this, probably. I mean, we can't say for sure, but it makes sense. Especially since the first and second estates and the king pretty much lost a significant amount of their power, and the third estate gained all of that power. So at least the upper ones did. So they're not thrilled with that idea either. This is going to be reinforced when the king attempts to escape France. He is able to sneak out of the palace where he and his family had been held captive. They ended up heading out towards Austria, got recognized on the road. It's actually a really funny story. If we ever do end up meeting up again this year, I'll tell you the story. I don't want to get too far off from the notes, but it's a fun story if you ever want to know about it. But he ends up getting caught and dragged back, and this time fully locked up. They already didn't like Austria very much, so this just made it that much worse. And so this is going to just drive everybody to think, oh no, all this stuff that we fought for, not only did we not get what we wanted, we also are about to lose the little that we did get. So all of this is going to lead to an overall demand for a republic and for universal rights for all men. Get rid of the constitutional monarchy, give an equal vote to all men in the country, no matter what their status is. This would be even further than the Americans went. When the Americans established the Constitution, actually not long before this, in fact, by 1791, the Americans are just barely getting into really pushing this new Constitution that they've written, that we are at least somewhat familiar with today. Certainly after my government class, you will become more familiar with it. But the idea of what the Americans had just done with forming a republic was inspiring to the French. And not only that, they wanted to go even further and give the vote to everyone. This is overall going to put some pressure on those who are currently in power. And eventually, you're going to see two dominant factions rise in the legislature. There's more than these two, but these are the two really big ones. The Girondins and the Jacobins. Again, I'm probably mispronouncing those. I don't know French. But they are going to be the primary voices. The Girondins, a little bit more moderate. The Jacobins are the very radical, full freedom kind of guys. And both of these groups are going to push for war in spring 1792, specifically with Austria and Prussia. They want to spread the revolution. They believe correctly that by going to war, it will promote national unity, which I mentioned at the very beginning was a problem that France was facing. And this is going to allow them to use fear to be able to push reforms. So they will declare war in April 1792. Problem is, they're taking on the two most powerful groups in Europe, and France, while they had been one of the most powerful groups, have significantly lost a lot of their power and are not nearly as strong militarily as they thought. And so by just a couple months, they are losing territories very quickly. And those losses are going to make the lower classes radicalize even faster, which is not good. All right, let's pause here and jump over to our questions and see how many we can answer here. So, moderate settlement. So, why did the second phase of the revolution begin? Well, the second phase of the revolution is the radical phase, the Jacobin phase of the revolution. So if we jump back up here, the main reasons: internal opposition, external opposition, radicalization of lower class politics. Those three things are going to be the primary things that push into the second phase of this revolution. Number 10, describe how the lower class became more radical in politics. Well, here we're going to see this exclusion from full citizens' rights, the fear of counter-revolutionaries trying to take over, and the idea that the king and the first and second estates, the nobility and the church, were seeking to crush the rebellion. So those things. All right, and How did the war with Austria and Prussia affect politics in France? Because they were losing territories, it accelerated the radicalization of politics and the lower class. That's what I'm looking for there. All right. I think here I'm going to call it a day. I will upload a separate video for the next section. So if you need to go back and review any part of this, or if you have any questions, maybe you missed an answer or you're not sure what I was looking for, so far we have done numbers 1 through 11, so about halfway through the questions, nearly halfway, or right at halfway actually, on the notes. So I will do another one of these videos and I will upload it separately so you can separate it out. If you have any questions, do throw me an email. I will get it quickly and answer it as quickly as I can. All right.